Welcome to A Culture of Curiosity, a podcast delving into the school experiences of millions of children around the world. This is a curious podcast for educators by educators. And I'm Jack, a belonging and inclusion specialist.
And I'm Maureen, a former head teacher and now leadership coach and SEN specialist. We're talking all things inclusive education, creating a culture of curiosity around situations and dynamics that exist in every school, every day.
So whether you're a teacher, leader, or just passionate about creating schools where every child gets to belong, you've ended up in the right place.
Hello folks, before we dive into this episode, just wanted to let you know there's a couple of swears later on that we decided were too important to the message being shared to edit out. It's about, I think, 56 minutes in, so you may want to skip those 30 seconds. Hi everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of our podcast. I believe it's episode 4. It's not the 4th we're recording, but I believe it's episode 4 that's going to be going out. I'm Maureen, and I'm here with Jack, of course. And we've got a really lovely guest with us today, a lady called Meg Hughes. Meg is a UKCP registered psychotherapist and clinical supervisor and former teacher. And Meg's got 15 years working with individuals, couples and groups, both in private practice and in schools and in public sector. So she's got a really wide range of terms of reference here.
Hello, nice to be here.
Meg, it's really, really lovely to have you here. So the way that we start every episode is a bit ridiculous. It's a bit wonderful, I think. I've really grown to love it. When Mo first suggested the idea, I thought that she was bonkers. But I've really fell in love with this idea. So we call it a thought tickle. And basically, it's just a question that all of us will have a bit of a think about and answer, just to illustrate the point of how universal connection is, something to start the episode off with connection. So this week's thought tickle is, what's something that you were convinced was true as a child, but later realised was completely untrue or completely wrong?
So yes, this was an interesting question, definitely, and I came up with loads of ideas, which maybe says something. But the one that sticks out probably for me is, when you tried something new to eat. Or my dad would always say, "Oh, that'll put hairs on your chest," and that thought of, "Well, I've done it. Are they there? Are they there?" It's definitely
when do they appear?
Somewhere. Yeah, they never did, thankfully, but there's definitely something there about that.
Oh, that's brilliant. That would really give someone a phobia about food, actually, if you think about it. Oh my God,
And it's always veg things that we say, just try that, it'll put hairs on your chest. And then we wonder why children have got such an issue with eating veg.
Yeah, I think it was done in a real sort of, whoa, it'll make you really strong kind of thing. It was like a bit of a strange one, but I believe it.
So strong, you'll have a big old hairy chest. Wonderful. I mean, I love it. What about you, Mo?
Okay, I've got one, but I'm sort of turning it on its head a little bit. I inadvertently created a myth that somebody else believed until they were an adult.
Oh, on the go.
I was about 10 and I had this friend called, I'm going to call her Rebecca. We went to the same school together, and she came round to play at my house. Now, I lived on a housing estate in Nottingham, and there was this little sort of mini roundabout thing. And in the middle of it, there was this huge concrete slab that was raised about 1.5 foot off the ground, came up, and it had a grid in it, which I know it was a sewer. I know that's what it was. But it made these sort of really clanking and clunking noises. But it was our stage when we were a kid. We would all go onto this roundabout and we'd perform all these dances and all these sort of, things that are going on. So we used it a lot. So when Rebecca came round, we went on there and we were standing on it and we were messing about, and the clunking noises started. And she said, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, that's the alligators." She was like, what? I'd convinced her. I thought it was obvious that I was joking, but I just said, yeah, there's alligators that have escaped from Twycross Zoo, and they run through all the sewers in Nottingham, and that's them that you can hear. Now, she just sort of went quiet and whatever you, date finished. And I caught up with her again years later, and it was through Friends Reunited. It was when that first started out. And she confessed to me almost immediately. She said, I was terrified, I believe that. And I was terrified. And every time I went to the toilet, I was terrified because I thought an alligator was going to come up and bite me on the backside. And she said, it wasn't until I was like in my late 20s that I realised that it was just a load of rubbish. So I inadvertently created this thing for this poor girl. I feel so bad about it.
Oh goodness. But I'd all I keep thinking about is I wonder how many people she's told and how many people that they have gone on to tell. And I love the idea of this kind of sewer Loch Ness monster in Nottingham all because of something you said.
Because
I
I just
love
made
it.
up a load of rubbish one day. Ages of nonsense.
Oh goodness. Oh, that's a
How
great
about
one.
you, Jack?
Well, I think we've all had this one, and it was very naive, I think. So I grew up on the Isle of Wight, and at the time we had a primary, middle, and high system, which meant my sort of first big school transition was a bit younger than what we see it at now. And I was really lucky in my primary school. It was the one school in my journey that was quite positive in its experience. I had really lovely staff, and I bumped into one of them in Summerfields. For our listeners that don't remember Summerfields, that's because you're a young person, and that's quite upsetting in itself. I loved the Summerfields.
Jack,
So
you're about 12. Go on, go on.
I may be the youngest in our partnership, but I am no longer a young person. I had to explain to a group of ECTs a couple of weeks ago who the Spice Girls were, and that.
No.
I mean, what did they go to uni for?
Oh
What was the
my
point?
God.
What was the point?
Oh my days.
So yeah, that wasn't great. So I bumped into a teacher in Summerfields, and I screamed her name. And she turned around and she said, "Oh, don't say that. Everybody will know just how old I am." And she said, "Call me Sheila." And there was a genuine moment that kind of stopped me in my tracks. So I thought, why on earth would I call you Sheila? I had no consideration whatsoever that my teachers at school had first names, that they had lives outside of school. It's the same idea as, you see them in the shops and you think, what are you doing here? Why
Yeah.
have you left that building?
Don't you live at school?
But it was one of those weird things where, as menial as it sounds, it was quite earth-shattering. It was like this whole system I'd come to know had just been sort of ripped out from underneath me.
I'm just talking about some serious stuff. The title is Shame is Forever. And before we get into that though, Meg, because I've already intimated,
Yeah.
you started out as a teacher. So talk to us about the journey. How did you go from teacher to psychotherapist?
Well, it wasn't planned. That's the first thing. If anyone had turned around to me and told me that I'd be doing a different, career later on in life than a teacher,
Yeah.
I would have laughed at them and said, "Don't be stupid. That's ridiculous." I was a teacher for about 9 years, and became part of middle management, and then had a young family, and the two didn't really match up very well in terms of the school I was working in at the time. There was lots of kind of issues, and I'm talking about that being nearly 20 years ago now. And so I decided to take a little sabbatical. It was supposed to be 6 months, and I was going to go back on supply because I thought, well, that's an easy way to maybe
Yeah.
still be a mum at some time and, work. And actually what happened was I finished in the July, and the plan was to go on a supply, maybe Easter time the next year or something. And in that time frame, well, two things happened. A very nice thing happened. I became pregnant with my second child, but unfortunately at the same time, my dad suddenly died, which it catapulted me into a part of my life that I wasn't definitely not ready for. My background came to bite me, shall I say,
Yeah.
and what really happened was about 6 months after my second child was born, a very dear friend said to me, kind of got me in a corner and said, "I think you need to speak to somebody." One of the where you go, "What do you mean?" I think maybe a therapist would be a good idea. And totally shocked, I thought, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me?" But actually, they were very right, and I think what they'd sort of identified in me was a lot of repressed emotions, probably, and the way that it was coming out. So I've sort of followed this friend's lead and went to therapy. And I think I was really lucky because the person I met, the therapist I met, and the type of therapy that I entered into, it changed my life. And it changed my life within a year. But the plan was always to go back to teaching, apart from the course to start training as a psychotherapist started in the September. Um, so through lots of discussions with my husband, I decided that I was going to do that, and that would be a way in which I could sort of have a career and also be at home with the kids. Ultimately, that led then into 4 years of training, and then qualifying, and then building practice after that. So, and that's kind of where we're at now. So I've been working in one school now for 13 years as a school counsellor, and have a private practice alongside that.
Okay. And
Wow.
so that's amazing. And so you still work with young people, do you then?
I do, yeah. So I had about 5 years where I didn't, but then once I qualified, I started volunteering, really. In one of the schools that I worked with, they said, "Yeah, I mean, they take voluntary school counsellors. Yeah, great, we'll have you." So I started volunteering, and then they eventually started paying me a little bit, and then started paying me properly, and that really.
Yeah. And I think that's really good. I think that's fantastic that you've actually still serving the young people that you always served, but in a different context now.
Yeah, I think there's something for me where I think honestly, if there aren't people like us in schools, what do children have? And that might sound a bit narcissistic, but
No, it doesn't.
I think there's a line of truth in that about people with experience. There aren't that many people with very long-term mental health experience anyway, and just free access for children to services. It's very rare, so that's part of what keeps me going, I think.
It's a sad thing as well, isn't it, that we're talking about something really beautiful and really wonderful, but we're very aware that the role of a school counsellor, with the experience that you have, is really few and far between, and we know that that's such a problem. And we hope, don't we, that systems and things will continue to improve. But I love that that's still part of your journey. I think it's one of those weird things that for those of us that have worked in education, the idea of stepping out, I think sometimes, we all get to a point where we're ready to take a bit of a step out and leave completely, but there is always something that will draw you back. I'm all right with that. There's something that brings you back, and I think I'd go a bit balmy without having that sort of capacity to be child facing.
Yeah, I think as well there's a little bit in me that's probably the rebellious bit that wants to fight the system as well.
Yeah.
You know, I know it's from the bottom up, but I think there is a bit of
Being
an
the enemy within.
yeah, a little bit. Yeah, 'Cause
Yeah.
I think
I can really appreciate that one. Yeah.
there's a lot of I think within school counselling. Not everyone agrees with me around this, but I think within young people's school counselling, there's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen as well. So that like you rightly said, the child, has somebody that they can trust, rely upon. They do what they say, and they
Yeah.
don't overstep the mark.
Brilliant. That's great.
Oh, you've set my brain off already, Meg. That's it. So this week we're talking a bit about shame, and I think shame's a really interesting concept. It's something I find myself talking quite a lot about, and I think sometimes we have conversations around shame And we're scared to use the word, we're scared to talk about systems around processes, around experiences that ultimately can and do result in an experience and feeling of shame. But I'm wondering, how would you maybe help us to differentiate, or what would you say the difference is between shame and maybe guilt?
It's a really great question, and I think there's a lot of debate about it. But and it's actually something that comes up a lot in sessions about guilt and shame. For me, I think it might sound quite simple, but I think guilt is when you do something wrong, you've done something wrong, you're guilty of doing something wrong. Shame is when you feel wrong.
That's brilliant. That is that is a fantastic definition.
Because
Yes.
a lot of young people will come in and say, "Oh, I feel really guilty. I feel really bad." They're not talking about the same thing. So when I say, "So what have you done? What do you think you've done wrong or wrongly?" They're like, they can't think of what it is they might have done wrongly, but what they can do is tell you they feel bad, and those two words, shame and guilt, are mixed up in young people's vocabulary.
I'd also argue that it's mixed up in the adults around them who have put that in there. They might think that what they're doing is trying to instill a bit of guilt so that somebody doesn't repeat an action, but actually the way they do it is all it's doing is putting shame into that young person.
And it's a really good example, isn't it, that because the adults around the young person talked about their behaviours, that would be a very different place to them talking about the person. When you do that, or I feel like this when you do that, is very different to you're wrong, you're not okay. It's very different.
I knew I was going to enjoy this episode. I knew that I was going to love you, Meg. So it almost feels a bit like, and please tell me if I've got the wrong end of the stick, but the guilt almost feels self-reflective. It's kind of, considered over something I've done, like you said. But shame almost feels imposed because it's often how I've either learnt to make myself feel, or it's how I've acquired feeling from other people. It feels kind of put upon me.
Yeah. And
that's rough.
Yeah. And it's your sense of identity, isn't it? Your sense of being. Shame is much more around I am not okay here. I meet a lot of young people who their sense of themselves is that they must be the one that's bad. Rather than, for example, a behaviour that they might have been involved with.
Yeah.
It's that sort of acting in, isn't it? Rather than acting out, it's acting in. You're saying, what I'm hearing is that the shame causes the is it too dramatic? It can lead to sort of self-loathing, or sort of really not feeling good about who you are, not what you've done, but who you are.
Yeah, who you are. And of course that then impacts their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviours in every environment then that they're in. And react against,
So how does it manifest itself in schools then? If a young person is walking around with shame, how do we actually spot that? How do we know that that's happening?
I think that's a really difficult, really difficult thing to answer, because I think there's some young people that it's really obvious within, but I think it comes out from a behavioural sense.
Yeah.
That you'll notice young people that, like a good example might be a young person that continually puts themselves down. And won't accept success or their achievements. That might be a someone that you might kind of think, that's interesting. But then if you think about a child who has shame induced from a family system, you might see them acting out in school. You might see them as the child that's always on the corridors, the one that's told that they've got anger issues. That comes up a lot.
Because school becomes the safe place to release.
I think it's I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a group of staff about a little lady that I used to work with. And it took us a long time to really consider the kind of impact of shame for her. But I think it took us so long to consider because it didn't look the way that we'd expected. So we had quite complex relationships at home. And because of a particular incident, she had quite a complex relationship with a member of staff. But with new staff, and we had quite a high churn in sort of turnover of staff, she was really, really eager to please. She was the young person who was desperate to hand out books, who was first to volunteer to do something. And what we started to notice that the kind of commonality became that she was desperate for a kind of connection that she felt proved some of her own feelings wrong. Almost, that she was desperate to consider that I can be something else and they will find it, they'll notice. If I do this for them, they'll stop thinking I'm this and they'll stop believing that I'm this. And it was really interesting because it didn't look the way that we kind of anticipated. And it was heartbreaking. It was really heartbreaking, this shame that she was carrying. We thought of it like this weight. There was a campaign, wasn't there, about the weight of trauma? Was it sort of every child carrying a backpack?
Oh, yeah.
And we played with this idea around experiences and how heavy would those experiences be in her little backpack. And oh my God, you'd barely get her backpack off the floor. And it was hard, but it didn't look the way we expected.
And you also think about, I mean, obviously this is back in time, but how is that young person going to go into adulthood and through their life with that? What's the sort of long-term impact of that sort of thing? It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that for me, I always, certainly when I meet young people, I think it's mostly stress that brings about shame, either in family systems or within school systems or friendships or relationships, full stop, really. But what's good stress and how does that manifest itself? And what's bad stress and how does that manifest itself? And what's the shame that's been brought about by that? And often I think there's a lot of trauma-based shame. Shame very often induced by some either trauma with a little t that's consistent and often, or big traumas that it's induced from an event or events. And it's kind of pulling apart the things that is good in the young person's life and what isn't, and how we can explore shame that way.
It's an interesting consideration, and forgive me if I'm bouncing back a bit, around how would we spot it and what does it look like, and we know that will be hugely individual. But I think the conversation that we do have to have is a tricky one. But we've got to consider, if we're talking about an education provision or in a school, that there are children and young people that have become very, very good at masking and cloaking their kind of outward experience, which means we might never catch it, we might never spot it. But one of the things that we can absolutely have some kind of influence on is the experience that we offer. If we can't spot it, how do we do our sort of damnedest to make sure that we're not part of those experiences, that we're not utilising systems that offer shame as an experience. And we've got to have that conversation. We know that there are experiences offered in schools at the moment that rely on shame as a practice. And those are difficult conversations. They're heavy, they're tricky. But I was reading about this idea on LinkedIn by a friend of Monar's, a lovely guy called Roger Mitchell, about this idea of institutional indifference. That to assume that we are never part of the problem, or that we might never have been part of an experience, whether, inadvertently or not, that's resulted in something that could have quite poor influence, becomes part of the problem. So we've got to have the conversation. We've got to be able to talk about what's our end of the bargain and how do we make sure that what we're doing isn't, intended or not, having these kind of shame-based influences.
Yeah, and I think it's such a good point. I've got an example of something that happened recently that I just thought is a really good example of this. And this kind of happens quite a lot within my work. Is a young person had got a neurodiverse diagnosis, very obvious one for me, not so obvious, strangely, for other people, but I think that's something that's quite common at the moment. And a message was sent out to all this young person's teachers to confirm that this diagnosis had happened, and it was really important. And the young person and I had worked on the student voice and put a list together, and that list went out with the message to this young person's teachers about what would help. Bearing in mind this young person is not doing GCSEs, so they've probably got, what, I don't know, 12 subjects on their timetable. How many teachers actually talk to that young person? One.
No.
And the one person, but that's the person that young person talked to me about. So the young person came and said, oh, this person was amazing. They just stopped me and said, I've read this information. I'm really sorry I didn't know. If there's anything I can help with, let me know. That was all that was needed.
Yeah.
Yes.
But not from
Wow.
anyone else. And I think that it actually comes down to that sort of acknowledgement of the young person's story sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's met with empathy and compassion.
Yes. And
And we-
it's a 30-second conversation on the corridor. It's nothing. It's nothing to give, but to receive would be everything.
And the shame that young person feels in those other areas of the school continues,
Yeah.
but not with this particular teacher. Something's really changed.
I guess there's also a bit of an acceptance and acknowledgement thing, isn't there? Like you mentioned, Meg. I mean, I'm, a huge fan of Pace or Place, depending on what you've read, and the acceptance bit is often the bit that we find really difficult. I give the example of a young person saying something like, "I know you hate me." As an example, there's a kind of real visceral kind of gut reaction of, I don't hate you. I really don't hate you. I think you're wonderful. And the bit that obviously often we get wrong is that what we've done in that experience or that exchange is that I've told you that what you perceive, your experience is untrue. It's not right. It's wrong. And sometimes, I'm thinking about your example, a message like that. Sometimes it might be that some staff will have reflected and gone, then there's maybe things that I've been part of that have caused that young person to have a really tricky time. And most of them won't be awful, terrible people. There'll be people that just didn't know, that didn't have that consideration because they didn't know. And I'm a real firm believer, you can't know something until you know it. But that ability to, to say, I'm really pleased that I know this now because I want to figure out what's the best thing that I can do that will help. Now we can work together. Now we can figure it out. And things that we've done in the past that haven't been helpful, I'm really sorry. And it's hard to be able to hold that and go, I definitely got that wrong. But it's important, I think, relationally it's important.
You're bringing something that I talked about just yesterday about apologising. And it's so rare, and I have to say particularly in high schools, it's so rare to actually have an adult apologise to a child. And even when it's done in such a way that's almost gaslighting about, it's your fault that I didn't know this stuff. Or if you hadn't acted that way, I wouldn't have made this mistake. But the actual power of just owning a mistake, owning something that you have done. How do our kids possibly learn what an adult taking responsibility looks and feels like if there are so few people around them prepared to do that?
And it also models what they learn in their behaviour going forwards as an adult, doesn't it?
It really does. It really does. So if we were talking, Meg, about schools and the way that people do things, and I can sort of hear the argument that comes back, or the viewpoint that comes on, well, we don't have the time to do all of that, and we don't have this, and this isn't us. So to what extent, I'm wondering, is the systems that are traditionally within school either helping or hindering these conversations from happening?
Personally, I think they're hindering an awful lot. I think, and I'll give you an example that I've been in the same school for a really long time, gone through a number of different heads and different kind of directions of the school. The school has always been really well known for its sort of social and emotional care, and now there's a big change,
Right.
and it's academic, and that's the sense of the world in schooling for me at the moment, that no matter where you are, no matter what place you're in, no matter what your students are, they have to achieve these academic goals, and their mental well-being is something that's, well, I don't know that it's even taken much into consideration, or it's given a nod to.
It seems to just become more binary, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a good way of
It's
describing
either you're academic or you're caring. And for the listener, on the screen we've got a video, and I'm in the middle of my video, and I've got Jack and Meg to the side. I'm in the middle of a trio of people who are very intelligent, who have very solid and quite advanced academic grounding and qualifications, and are extremely caring as well. So just by looking at my screen, I know that's rubbish. And yet, why is it? Why is it that there is in schools increasingly, it's coming back and it's worrying, that you're either academic or you're caring, and it's nonsense.
There's a quote. I've just been aggressively searching for it, because as soon as you started talking, Mo, I had to get it in. It was. I went to a session at the Festival of Education last summer by a lady called Jerry Robinson, who works in an alternative provision, I believe. Really, really wonderful lady, really generous with her time, and she offered this quote, and it's by a lady called Tanya Clark from a piece of research out of the University of Cambridge in 2020. And the quote is that there is an assumption that there exists a trade-off between well-being and academic achievement, and that improvements in one will always come at the expense of the other. And it's becoming such a prolific concern, and I get it. I understand the consideration, but I think, while we're rightly talking about the well-being of the children and young people attending these provisions, I think that same trade-off also has great risk to affect the well-being of the staff, who are really struggling with that too.
Absolutely.
That are really aware of the system that they are part of and the plates that they have to keep spinning up in the air, but are very aware of the impact that can have. And that must be so difficult to kind of see it from both sides as well in that context.
Absolutely. Meg, I'm just going from what Jack's just saying here, I keep thinking of those 11 teachers that didn't reply to that young person's the email about that. And I'm thinking, I'd love to have a conversation with them. Because how many of them was it, as Jack said, what's the impact on their well-being, having read this and realised this? Is it their own guilt that's stopping them? Is it the pressure of, yeah, that's all very well, but I've got to get all of these kids through this exam, I'm just intrigued, really.
And the two things I can think of that there's, if the senior leadership of a school buy into a holistic approach, then they may, for example, really go for a trauma-informed school approach. There's a psychotherapist called Margot Sunderland who is doing amazing work with trauma-informed schools. In a nutshell, it is about having relational approaches and training every staff member in a trauma-informed approach, which I know this word is bandied about a lot now, and people have different understandings of it, but ultimately shame is in this picture. And the other side of this is a couple of years ago I worked with the BACP to deliver some training, delivering training on how to supervise in education, about how supervision can be set up within schools. So how they supervise each other. It's not line management supervision. It was, teacher to teacher supervision. Teachers don't get that either. They never get a place to have supervision where it's not about results or the next new thing that's come along or the next change they have to make or the marking scheme or something they might have done wrong even. So I think it's
that whole, it's sad and it's frustrating that education remains so rooted in a model that was created in the Victorian era. In spite of all, you may be using technology in a different, and all these things that have been invented, but it's still the same Victorian system, and it's that the person who is standing in front of the classroom is missed out of that whole system, as much as the belonging. I think there's probably another episode there, Jack, about belonging as the staff member and feeling that having your needs met, and you're so right, Meg, that idea of the person who's in there being safe enough to acknowledge your own mistakes, your own error. It must be that the system is creating shame in the adults. Must be.
Yeah. And the only time really that I see mental well-being brought in for teachers is when there's been a crisis in a school. When there's been a terrible trauma or a crisis, and then everything's brought in as an emergency response. They're given a few sessions and off they go. They're expected to just cope.
I've had that personal experience of it. Very unfortunately, there was a sudden death in the school, on the teaching staff, and there was it happened actually in the Easter holidays. So there was a few days where I was the one that was doing stuff on my own and contacting colleagues and making sure that everyone knew what had happened. So I didn't, but all I kept thinking of, what was driving me, I didn't have any experience of it, but what was driving me was actually something that had happened way back in a school when I was just starting out, where I turned up after the Christmas holidays and I had classes, and I was just a little bit late. I'd missed briefing, and there was this thing of there's a book and you write if you miss briefing, and I looked at the book and I did what have you, and it was lunchtime and I had a PSHE lesson, the lesson after lunch, and I just happened to hear someone mention a child's name and say, because of what happened with, and I was like, what has happened with her? I was due to have her class, and I found out that she died in the holidays. That was how I found out. And I just felt and I just thought, that's awful. I was just 5 minutes away from doing a register and mentioning her name. And that was the only term of reference I had for all the years later when I was the head and there had been this traumatic event in school. And so I spent the entire Easter holidays making sure I personally spoke to every member of staff to tell them myself, because I didn't want to. The worst thing I could think of was the idea of turning up and not knowing that had happened. And then I had about a week of the local authority. I was being too generous, and I had one meeting, which was an emergency strategy meeting with someone from the local authority. And everything else that I brought in post-vention intervention workers from Samaritans and all sorts, and everything I did myself, and I did it out of instinct. And actually I'm thinking that's really wrong. There should have been somebody not just having that one meeting with me, but actually where was anyone checking in to make sure that I hadn't just gone off on some wild tangent? Where was anyone checking in with me? It's really mad that we don't have that structured support around the staff?
Yeah, this episode's going to be one of those, isn't it, that leaves me with a huge amount to think about. I'm going to be writing notes by my bed for days. It's great to see that more conversations are being had around relational approaches. I mean, I'm a huge advocate for relational approaches. All of the work I deliver is grounded in a relational approach. I'm a huge advocate for a trauma, responsive approach and experience to education. I wrote a bit of a session about how do we take the sort of, the flash in the pan training, or the sort of, the new information, and how does it become something that isn't wheeled out when, we've had a call on the radio and you think, oh, right, what's my trauma-informed script? And, how do we make this something that lives and breathes for everybody, not just in response to crisis or a trauma and a traumatic experience? But how does this become something that's commonplace, that's uniform almost in its, I think a lot about children that are moved, that their experiences changes via a managed move. And I think that the system at the moment has such disparity in it that child could have been moved from one provision to another, and their experience could be wildly different. Yeah. Because of the kind of choices that may have been made about what kind of provision and experience is available.
And also the assumptions of, or presumptions of people once that child is then in the new place. They don't come with a sign, do they, that says, I'm here because. And again, it comes back to that sort of shame-based process, but I think it's, I think someone said it right at the beginning, it's endemic in society, isn't it? But it's a really challenging concept to change.
So you're right, what can we do? What can we do to create those environments that reduce the risk of shame and the impact of shame? I worry because so many people presume things that are important to do are hard to do.
Well, I would argue that, is it hard to help a young person and collaborate with them to make sense of something? Is it difficult to meet their story with empathy and compassion? Is it difficult to just sit with them in pain, which I think is actually the most prominent one? Can we help name their pain for them, with them? I don't know. I'd argue maybe that those things aren't as difficult as people make out. I think a lot of people, and if we're talking about schools, teachers, those words aren't available to them because they are working within a very academic vocabulary. That makes sense. It's like if I go in and talk about collaborative sense making with a young person, a teacher will go, oh yeah, I know what you mean, but that's not talked about in relationally.
No.
How many times have you been in a classroom where a young person wants to tell their story and a teacher goes, yeah, but that's not really what we're talking about, or I'll just stop you there, and then that young person hasn't had chance to tell their story. What do they take away from that?
Absolutely. That my story doesn't matter, or it isn't as important as being able to do simultaneous equations or whatever it is that they happen to be doing.
Or it's got to be something else.
Simultaneous equations, I hate them. But and you're right, and it's interesting something you said there, Meg, about the idea of and I hadn't really considered it in this way. So thank you. But the idea of those of us in schools not actually necessarily having the language or the vocabulary to be able to articulate. It's not necessarily the will to do it, it's actually the means, do you think?
And the time.
Time, of course, but on time.
Every minute is precious, isn't it, to a teacher in a lesson? You're whipping through stuff. I think that was one of the... It's interesting, actually. I was thinking just before, I think that was one of the challenges I found so hard being a teacher. I think I cared too much, if that's possible. Soon, just to let you know, Jack, Maureen knows this, but a year after I got my first job, I was made head of year the following year, and then stayed a head of year, and then worked in sort of pastoral for a very long time before sort of changing a little bit towards the end. But I just found it so heartbreaking that I didn't have the power to do anything different. And I think that's what teachers are up against all the time. And that was part of my decision to move out of that situation. It was like I cared more about what the young person was going through and wanted to give them the time than I did about teaching them anything to do with, well, in my case, it was geography, even though I loved it, and I loved teaching. But it was about, who are you? What do you need from me right now? Because also, as well, I think something that we forget or maybe teachers don't have time to think about, is the young person in front of us, those 30 children in the classroom. Each one of them is coming from a powerless position. They have no power to change their environment outside of your classroom or at home. None.
Absolutely. That's really interesting to me, because obviously we started out in our careers as teachers at the same time. Yeah. And I really resonate with what you said about that feeling of, this isn't right. I don't want, and again, for those of you who are listeners who are geography teachers, please don't think that Meg and I are anti-geography, Oxbow Lakes and all that. We love them. But I had almost at the same time that same feeling of, this isn't what I need to be focusing on. The kids don't need me to focus on that, because actually there's textbooks, there's all those other, and there's other people who are far more passionate academically than me. But rather than it leading to, as it did with you stepping out and going into a different specialism, me and my pig-headedness was, well, I now need to be a head teacher so that I can decide what we're focusing on. Yeah, good old pig-headed Mo just thought, right, I'll just go straight to the top and I'll sort it out from there. I suppose that means I've now got to become the Secretary of State for Education, if I really say it so.
Yes. But it's a really good example, isn't it? But I think my fear is that senior managers now, that's not where they're focusing. So the infiltration all the way down the school, through middle management, through teachers, to the children, is academia and not much else. I mean, even pastoral systems are being, reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced.
I think there's a lot of work potentially. If you want to break the cycle of shame, we have to look at what training, what support is being given to the senior leaders, so that there is more understanding around, on a practical level, and you have to be realistic about this, on a practical level, of actually breaking that myth of it's not a lot of work. It's little things done consistently across the board from the top down, maybe.
And training's a massive part of that, which is it's a bit of a bugbear, isn't it, within education anyway, and especially training that's about emotional based or relational based mental well-being. One of the things I see very often with shame is how a young person is carrying so many emotions, so many feelings. How do we help them to have those feelings, be aware of what those feelings are, express those feelings safely in an empowered way that doesn't get them told off because they're being angry? There's a real big problem, I think, in schools about children who are seen as enraged, angry children rather than empowered, angry children.
Yeah.
And there's an answer for shame for me straight away. It's like, if young people can have empowered anger, absolutely, and grieve and have self-compassion, we're on a winner. But it's how do we get there is really tricky.
One of the things that scratches away in my little brain a lot, I mean, my route through education was different. I think it was fueled by a similar kind of, I want to be the person who can make damn sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anybody else, or can be done differently. But there's a great focus. I think, firstly, one of the myths that we've got to bust is that often conversations like ours are heard as being very anti-academic, or and by no means are we suggesting that we sort of bin the curriculum, that we, spend our lives outside picking daisies and making daisy chains. That's what we'll do 5 days a week. But that, again, back to that quote, that one doesn't have to exist in opposition with the other, but we spend, rightly so, lots of time considering our kind of academic pedagogy, how it is that we think about learning and the experiences that we cultivate to offer learning. But we kind of caveat the word learning to be purely academic in its content. That when we talk about behaviour, why is it that we can't consider some of the same pedagogical approaches that we offer to all of our academic content in the same way that we think about helping you, the same way that we think about offering you new ways to communicate, other behaviour that will keep you safe and help us to meet your needs, experiences that will help you to feel empowered in the emotions that you're processing, the experiences that you're going to have, whether we would like it a certain way or not, But why can't we have this middle bit where that same kind of thinking, that same kind of logic almost, can cross over? That question drives me nuts. It haunts me.
It's a great point, isn't it? I was just thinking then as you were talking, Jack, the teachers that children tell me about are teachers that do that naturally. They do both together. They're interested in the child and they're interested in the academic side.
I think that one of the ways that, in my view, because we've got to sort of think about practical ways that kids can support people who are struggling with shame, and that idea of we see learning as being something that is academic, and it's taking those two things together. For instance, timeout cards. Good old timeout cards, which are absolutely the idea of giving a young person the green light, as it were, to step out of the world that they're in for a moment and step back in. Absolutely wonderful. And I've delivered training in a number of places where people have said, oh, we do this, but it doesn't work, or, and I've only just recently hit upon the response that seems to have an impact. And I said, okay, and I'll ask the teacher, what subject do they teach? Let's say it's English. And I said, okay then, so let's imagine good old fronted adverbials, which for some reason suddenly people have decided that 11-year-olds need to know about fronted adverbials in SATs testing. I said, right, so you have to show that kids can understand and use fronted adverbials, don't you? Yeah, okay. So how do you do that? Do you just tell them what it is and then move on to the next bit? No. What do you do? And I said, tell me how a child would learn that, how you teach that. I said, well, we'll model it, we'll give an example, we'll give them questions to actually test that they have the basic understanding, and then we'll switch up the scenarios so that we test that they can use it and recognise it within different contexts, and then we'll remove the scaffold so that they're on their own. I said, all right, so you don't just say to them, this is a fronted adverbial, and then never give them any further support, and then just put them in front of the SATs paper and say, now use it when it really matters. What? No, I'd never do that. I said, but isn't that what people do when they just give the kid a timeout card and say, use it when you really need it? And there's no practice. And the whole concept that I've just recently started introducing in when I deliver training is you practice the things and giving them practical structures for, you do this every day at 11 o'clock, you'll just turn over the timeout card and the kid will walk out, and where you'll go is you do this and 5 minutes and you'll come back. If you're not practicing these things in the same way that you do with any other academic subject, with an academic subject, how are you learning them?
It's a really good point. I think there's something else you hit on as well there, Mo, is how the teacher can take responsibility for supporting the young person in that process, rather than an example that I see a lot is the child is given the timeout card to show the teacher when they need it, which is
Yeah.
often argued about.
And then they never use it.
They don't use it, yeah.
Because actually that in itself has become something that is feels shameful about.
My brain is whirring. It's absolutely whizzing. I'm thinking a bit about language. I have been accused several times of being a member of the language police. I'm a bit of a stickler for language. And we hit on this a bit earlier about this idea of when shame becomes kind of an identity. There's a video that I watch and talked about a bit. It's a video called "Why Am I Rude?" And it was created by an organisation in Cambridge, I think, and it talks a lot about this idea of rude, and I am rude because of X, Y, and Z. And one of the examples is I'm rude because that's who you've decided I am, so I might as well be. That when we think about the impact that language, even, and these are often examples that are not done with the intention of harming, they're not done to cause harm to people, but that doesn't mean that they don't cause harm to people. Those words around, well, Meg, Mo's going to be in your class, and watch out for Mo. She's a troublemaker.
She's been told that before.
Yeah, and I get that a lot in the sort of the young people that are referred to me. They'll come with a label. I remember one particular one that was just wonderful because we worked together for a really long time afterwards. But one young person that came with an attachment disorder and walked in very surly and sort of looked at me and went, "And who the fuck are you? And what are you gonna do?" And she said something like, "I've got a fucking attachment disorder, don't you know?" And I just said, and it came out of my mouth before I'd even thought about it. I said, "Well, why don't you leave the fucking attachment disorder at the door and just come in?" And she looked at me, and I thought, that moment where your stomach hits the floor and you think, "Oh, am I going to?" And actually, she came in and we worked together for a long time together. And
Yeah.
but there's a really good example of, she'd already decided she wasn't okay. And it was about, well, I can decide whether you're okay or not, but let's start afresh. And I think that's something that a lot of young people bring, don't they, to each class, that someone will have heard about them, or they know about them, or they're wandering the corridors and everyone knows them in a certain way. It's a very challenging situation to tackle shame, I think, in organisations.
And for some kids, it becomes the only support system that they find accessible, because that manufactured almost dependability, regardless of whether it's quite harmful, is dependable. I experienced this as a kid, that I could rely on the systems that I had navigated myself. I knew that X equated to Y, and when I felt out of control, I could rely on that. So that identity becomes so ingrained sometimes that it's really hard for some children to separate the ideas, or to separate that they are not their behaviours.
Yeah.
And that label becomes this great big thing. I met a kid called Denzel a couple of months ago, and I met him in reception. I was signing in, and I always have a giggle when I'm signing in a primary provision, because the sign-in systems where you have to have your photo taken, they're all about 3 foot off the ground. Now I'm 6'4". The positions I have to contort myself into to take my photograph is ridiculous. So I've had a bit of a giggle, and this little man appears, and again, similar to your example, Meg, he went, "Who the fuck are you?" And I went, "Hiya, I'm Jack, who are you?" And he went, "I'm Denzel, what are you here for?" I said, "Oh, I've come to meet some of the teachers that work here." And he went, "Oh, which ones?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know yet." I said, "But I've come to meet some teachers." He said, "What do you want them for?" And I thought, great, I love this kid. I said, "Well, we're going to spend some time talking about how we can do the best as adults to look after everybody that goes to this school." And he went, "Oh, that sounds all right. Can I do that?" I said, "Mate, I'm really confident that you've got better things to be doing than listen to me waffling on for hours. But if you've got ideas, I want to hear them. Maybe we can chat at break. And he said, yeah, they won't let me do that. And I went, they won't let you do what? And he went, they won't let me. I'm bad news. And I thought, the thing that plagued me for the rest of the day was that me, a perfect stranger, you know, the guy that had just appeared in reception. Now, the funny bit was that the head teacher appeared round the corner with a real panicked look on her face. Apparently, Denzel wasn't supposed to be able to get as close to reception and visitors at that point. And I thought, well, didn't want to mention it. But all I thought about was that the first thing he felt, you know, whether it was sort of, you know, seeking connection, whether it was he kind of wanted to manage our interaction relationally, he told me he was bad news. The first thing he shared about himself was that he was bad news. And I mean, I had a little cry at lunchtime. I found that really hard. But it was really gutting that it had become who he was. You know, that was how he saw himself in the world, that it almost, you know, I mean, looking at some of the experiences he'd had, it really felt like it had become self-prophesizing. You know, that was who he was, so that was what he could depend on.
I imagine you were probably still processing it through that day, but did you get a chance to, did you mention it to the staff? Did you?
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation about it, and I said, without any other context, I've got to raise the alarm bells in the context of what that means. But I said, if it's appropriate, I'd really like to see him at lunch. You know, I'd really like to go and find him, just to have a chat. I said, you know, I'm very happy to be supervised. We'll have a bit of a chat. We'll bring him into something. I said, but I feel uncomfortable with that being the only interaction that we have. So I did get to see him at lunch. We had a great discussion over some peas, and the ridiculous nature of peas and forks. His biggest piece of advice for how teachers could do a good job of looking after them so that they could do a good job of looking after each other was on days with peas that they should be provided with spoons.
Fantastic.
I thought, great, absolutely true. But awesome little man, absolutely awesome. But there's something that really sits with me about the idea that the way he presents himself to others is that he's bad news. And you can see how, you know, as a young man, he's found himself in tricky situations where what he has done is he's utilised the ways he has learned to keep himself safe. And they are, you know, probably quite unhelpful to him and to others, but they work for him, you know. But this idea that at 11 years old, he's entering the next stage in his life, really firm in his belief that he is bad news. I find that really troubling. I find that really hard.
I think I'd have been crying in the toilets as well, actually, Jack. Yeah, just really, really, really bad. But it can't be all bad, surely. Let's try and sort of look at this about, you know, has anybody got any experiences, and Meg, I'll ask you first of all, about seeing where schools have worked to help transform young people's experience, and where they've addressed shame and they've actually made things better by doing things differently.
Yeah, I definitely have lots of examples of young people, but they're young people I've come into contact with. So they're young people that have come through the counselling referral route that I end up either, you know, seeing for a while or short term or long term. I'm very lucky in the school that I work in because I can work with them for as long as is needed, which is a really uncommon
Very
model.
rare. Very rare.
And yes, the answer I think is about a holistic system. If I can be a part of that system and advocate for young people around them, you know, and that's contact with the mental well-being services within school if they exist, then teachers, middle managers or senior leaders, and pastoral staff within that, but also home. If it can be a holistic picture, then I think we can see a lot of change. Other than that,
it's not just necessarily school, it's home, it's everywhere else. Like team around the child, as it were.
Yeah. And with the similar thinkers as well. If there's enough people that think similarly and a positive outlook and about the child, that can change and model a lot of change within the system, I think. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
Very, very.
Especially, I think, when they get to secondary school, and that was a point actually I thought about when you were talking, Jack. I think there's a lot of young people that have a really positive experience of the personal and relational in primary. They come to secondary, and it's like a bomb goes off. It's not the same. They don't
It's
have
like
that.
they fall off a cliff, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's so different, and I'm not really sure why that is the case, but there's something about that middle part, the secondary system, if you like, that the pastoral side of it, the relational side of it.
In my view, there's the lost key stage 3 isn't just academically. I actually think more so it's pastorally as well. That as soon as you come into a high school at the age of 11, the language, the expectation, the structure is key stage 4.
Yeah, you're expected to be much more developmentally progressed, aren't you, than
Absolutely, you go from being 11 to being 14, 15 in terms of the systems, the structures, the expectations, the language, all of the processes, everything, and you're still you're not. There's a hell of a lot of growing, changing, and developing that happens during that key stage 3.
I think those expectations are an interesting one, aren't they? I met a secondary head at an event last year who said, we've got a lot of children finding year 7 really difficult, and they're just all over the place. We've got children crying in the corridors, and you'd have thought that by the time they get to secondary, they'd have really nailed that down. And I thought, I'm 30-something, and I have 100% not nailed that down. I'm a person, weeping in the middle of a podcast episode. It's hard, isn't it? And what we're not doing, we're not tarring everybody with the same brush. I think maybe what we're pleading for collectively is systemic change. I mean, there are practitioners around the country, around the world, doing wonderful, wonderful things, but they're doing them because they are going out of their way to kind of operate within the system safely, but with enough flexibility. I visited a provision and they were talking to me about their year 6-7 transition, and their year 6-7 transition starts in year 4. And it starts in year 4 because what they do is they share facilities. So that there are certain parts of PE where they'll go to the secondary school and use the running track or the rugby pitches to start to build familiarity. And then what they might start to do in that second half of year 4 is they'll do a bit of cookery and DT, and then what they'll start to do is meet some of the secondary staff, and they might have a couple of secondary children that are already in that provision that will sort of say hello, give them tours, and the transition is much, much slower. And what they look to do is replicate and work with their feeder primary heads to replicate systems that exist. And it was really brilliant. It was really fascinating to see. And there was a genuine excitement, in children about what going to big school meant. Because some of the transitions, I used to live in an authority where you'd go from a feeder primary of 80 to a secondary of 2,500. That's huge. Absolutely. So much so, I visited that secondary. When you go to London and they've got those sort of bollards in the street that says you are here, and there's like a little map. They had those around their campus. It was that massive.
Wow.
And,
that would overwhelm me.
That's a big step for anybody, isn't it? So I'm thinking something that we could just try to take the first step with. I think is something that you mentioned towards earlier, Meg, was we kind of talk about sitting with a young person. Again, because we're adults, often we're fueled by this desire to help, to make things better, that we're not always good at listening to just hear, listening to allow somebody to feel heard and acknowledged, that we're very good at listening to respond, to know what to say next or how to try and bring them out of that particular feeling. And sometimes what we have to do is kind of just sit in it, to just sit with them and show them that we can sit with them and that there is somebody here with you. So I think if I was going to think of something that I could try to take that first step with, it's to really consciously listen, to hear, to listen to validate, and to listen to empathize, not because I need that information from you to conduct a process or to take the next step, just to hear you, I think would be something. Anything else that we think could be a worthwhile consideration with?
I've got one, and again, Meg, it's actually something you said that has triggered this sort of thought. How much do schools, when counsellors are brought in and other people who come in on as partners to the learning that's happening in schools, how much do schools routinely structure in opportunities for sitting down, booking an appointment with you as the counsellor and just listening? Because if part of your role is advocacy, you become, and it's not about confidentiality, it's not about all of those other things, all those things aside, but actually there must be a viewpoint there that every school would benefit from actually just listening to. And do schools do that, is my wonder. And if not, that's what would be for me a really easy fix.
Yeah.
If an hour of just, not just about what you've done with it, but actually I just want your feedback on, based on all the work that you've been doing on our school.
Yeah. I think over my experience, I've had lots of different kind of examples of what you're talking about. I've been very lucky to be part of a really, really great wellbeing service at the school I work in that is being constantly squeezed and squeezed and squeezed now, which is really difficult to watch. And there was a time when I was invited into the sort of mental wellbeing team that had senior leaders in, my line manager, and several pastoral staff, where we worked with catching the group of young people that didn't quite qualify for school counselling but had some issues. So what we did was we developed some group work around that and developed several different groups. But again, that was short-lived. There wasn't much. I think in answer to your actual question, well, the answer is no. It's very outcome-driven and data-driven. Prove that you're doing a job. Rather than, can you see what could be done in the school to help these young people? Which I think is maybe a great question for many people in my position in schools.
And maybe that's what we put out there into the universe as a result of this podcast, is try doing that, schools, and see what happens.
Yeah, and I think
all you're going to lose is an hour.
Yeah, and on the end of that is kind of, my experience of working within the mental wellbeing team that I'm in, there are so many people, external agencies coming in. There's probably 10 external agencies that are coming.
Meg, you, and I promise I mean this as a compliment, you've absolutely kind of set my brain on fire. I'm really thinking about the work that I do, that the children that I'm still really fortunate to be involved with, and the schools that we support them in. And I think what we're agreeing on is shame is a really complex experience, and one of the ways that we think we'll ever tackle those experiences is it's got to be part of a bigger conversation. We know that children's mental health and well-being has got to form much more of a consideration in the school experience. And I think there's great work being done, but it's something that we're reflective on. And I think that's something that we want to leave our listeners with, is if we feel powerless to influence other experiences when it comes to what our interactions offer to our children and young people. But I just want to thank you. It's been such a joy talking to you. Thank you for being so generous with your experience and your time. I'm going to be off on one for the rest of the day. And Maureen has made the mistake of copying us all into an email. So apologise in advance for the barrage of follow-up questions.
Definitely need to have Meg back at some point, don't we?
Thank you, Meg. It's been a real joy. Thank you, Mo, as always. And see you in the next episode.
Thanks, Meg, so much. Thank you.
Thank you.